But Dr. Peterson, in the cases where it does matter, right? Certainly you could envision, let's not talk so much about federal policy, but perhaps like in an actual like personal day-to-day setting, do you think there's a harm? So perhaps you can disagree with like the philosophical principle, the theoretical truth of whether or not identity can change subjectively whim to whim. But if someone comes up to me and says, you know, I want to be referred to as this, even if I adopt some sort of view that I don't really think fundamentally on a pure theoretical level they have an understanding of identity, do I then choose to harm them or potentially upset them by sticking to my belief about what their identity is?
Well, the first thing you'd have to establish is whether or not that would actually constitute harm.
Okay.
That's the claim. And the person might say, well, you're harming me, but that doesn't provide evidence that you are.
Does it?
People presume very often that they're harmed by things that they're not harmed by at all. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that the mere claim that someone thinks that the way I would address them might harm them gives them the right to enforce by legislation the content of my speech. That just doesn't work. And you know, here's something else that's worth noting from a more practical perspective. I mean, I've received letters from about 30 trans people. Mm-hmm. And that's actually a lot, because there aren't that many people. And these are people who, by and large, were very serious about their transformations.
Sure.
And all but one of them agreed with what I was doing, saying, first of all, that they never asked to be represented by the activists who claim to be representing them. Mm-hmm. Now, so here's a proposition, right? So imagine that there's a group of people, and that somebody is a member of that group of people. And then that person stands forth as a member of that group and says, because I'm a member of that group, I speak for all those people. It's like, actually, no, you don't. The mere fact that you're the member of a group doesn't give you any right whatsoever to speak on behalf of that group. Mm-hmm. You need to have legitimacy as a representative. And I think that you can hardly imagine a more pernicious example, say, of racism than to presume that if someone is black, they speak on behalf of all black people. Mm-hmm. All black people are homogenous. They all believe exactly the same thing. Therefore, if you've talked to or met one of them, you've talked to or met them all.
With respect, Dr. Peterson, I think I'm referring to cases where the actual people in front of you are telling you, though, that they want to represent themselves a certain way, right? So we can talk about whether or not the activist community is accurately representing actual communities, but I'm wondering, you mentioned you don't think like a self-report of like, oh, this is harming me, or I would not be comfortable interacting with you unless, you know, X happened, would not be an accurate way of describing real harm. Are there better metrics we have for real harm? If someone comes up to me and they say, oh, you know, when they're feeling too warm in this room, we should leave, you know, do I say, no, like, you don't know how warm you are. That's not something you can know for yourself. That's just a self-report.
Well, it would depend on what they were asking other people to do. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe that people have the right to impose restrictions on not so much restrictions on what I'm allowed to say, but to determine the content of my speech. That's an entirely different thing. And so if it's a matter of the legal principle of whether or not I'm free to determine the content of my speech, or the hypothetical discomfort of a hypothetical person, because no one's actually asked me this yet, then I'm going to go with the freedom from compelled speech. Partly, again, because I think that the idea that the government or any other institution should regulate the content of your speech is absolutely, it's intolerable.
I think you have a strong legal argument, right? So the government probably shouldn't mandate this. I'm sure a lot of people might agree with that. I'm still curious, though, in this hypothetical scenario that a student did or a person did approach you and they told you they would be harmed or they would be uncomfortable unless you referred to them with a certain pronoun, what would you do?
Well, I really have a hard time answering questions like that because they're asked in the hypothetical.
It could certainly happen, though.
It could, but my sense, because I'm a clinician, is that I generally handle those sorts of things at the level of actual detail. So I would say it would depend on the person, it would depend on the situation, it would depend on why they asked me, it would depend on how they asked me, it would depend on what I thought they were trying to accomplish by the request. It would depend on whether or not they were filming me while they were asking me. It would depend on whether they asked me in my office or in a hallway. You know, I can tell the difference between a genuine plea for understanding and a bit of political theater or political manipulation. Now, and I've dealt with people who've made all sorts of requests of me, believe me, because I've had a clinical practice for about 20 years, and my experience with a range of human behavior is, I would say, extraordinarily extensive. And so I've made all sorts of adjustments to the way I interact with people. So I can't say exactly what I would do in a given situation because I firmly believe that the devil is in the details. And I haven't been making a case about a specific interaction that I had actually experienced or yeah, experienced. I've been making a case, a philosophical, fundamentally a philosophical case, and secondarily a political case, and I think that I've made the case properly.
But you would say that you recognize a difference between a legal responsibility to do something versus a sort of an individual personal choice, I should do something,
well,
right?
sometimes I recognize that. I mean, sometimes the legal and the philosophical and the personal issue are all the same. It's simpler when that's the case. But I also think that the issue is essentially a red herring. I mean, look, since I made that video, for one reason or another, the things that I've been saying have become quite popular and not as controversial as you might think. Most of what I've accrued so far has been support. And the reason for that has very little to do with the issue of pronouns. The pronoun issue and the pronoun controversy is a pointer to something that's a lot larger, and that's why this issue has had legs. I'm not here because people are interested in my views on pronouns. Now, I happen to put my foot down, so to speak, at a particular place, because it's very frequently the case that if you're engaged in a complex philosophical dispute, which is the case for our society in general, that in order to make a statement about it, you have to make a statement in relationship to an actual cause. So you have to draw the line somewhere, and people have asked me, well, why did you pick the pronoun hill to die on? And my answer to that generally is, A, I didn't die, and B, you have to pick something real to enter into the debate. So, for example, if I would have just made another video decrying political correctness, it would have gone nowhere at all. But I said that there was something I wouldn't do, and one of the things I won't do is use the made-up words of postmodern neo-Marxists who are playing a particular game with gender identity that's an extension of their particular reprehensible philosophy. And if that happens to mean that I have to engage in discussions about whether or not, if a suffering and confused person who's had a very troubled pathway through life came and asked me politely if I would go out of my way to accommodate them, I don't think that those issues actually belong on they're not the same category of issue. I mean, so I don't see that there's, well, I guess that's enough said about that.
All right. Let's transition a little bit. So you mentioned sort of postmodernism and neo-Marxism. In fact, in a statement at McMaster University, you claimed that an expression that the protests that you see at your events are an expression of a philosophy that's grounded partly in postmodernism and partly in Marxism.
Yeah.
What does that mean, first? And secondly, how would you say that these movements are characterized in those ways?
Well, at McMaster, it meant that some of the protesters came and hid behind a banner that had a hammer and sickle on it. You know, hey, see, the funny thing is that people laugh about that, and I understand perfectly well why you're laughing. But I can tell you, you wouldn't have laughed if it would have been a swastika. And it's no funnier that it was a hammer and sickle. You know, the reprehensible ideologies that are based in fundamental Marxism killed at least 100 million people in the 20th century, and there's still apologists. 1 in 5 social scientists identifies as a Marxist. It's like, really, that's really where we're going to take this, is it? After the bloody 20th century, we're going to say, well, that wasn't real communism, or something foolish like that, even though we had multiple examples of exactly what happens when those doctrines are let loose in the world. And so what happened in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, as far as I can tell, and this happened mostly in France, which has probably produced the most reprehensible coterie of public intellectuals that any country has ever managed, is that in the late 1960s, when all the student activists had decided that the Marxist revolution wasn't going to occur in the Western world, and had finally also realized that apologizing for the Soviet system was just not going to fly anymore, given the tens of millions of bodies that had stacked up, that they performed what I would call a philosophical sleight of hand and transformed the class war into a identity politics war. And that became extraordinarily popular, mostly transmitted through people like Jacques Derrida, who became an absolute darling of the Yale English department and had his pernicious doctrine spread throughout North America, partly as a consequence of his invasion of Yale. And what happened with the postmodernists is they kept on peddling their murderous breed of political doctrine under a new guise, and resentful people all over the world fell for it. And I don't consider that acceptable. One of the things I've learned, for example, I teach my students in my second year personality class about what happened in the Soviet Union, in the Gulag Archipelago. And I use Solzhenitsyn as an exemplar, Alexander Solzhenitsyn as an exemplar of existential psychology, because I think he's actually the wisest of the existential psychologists, even though he was primarily a historian and a literary figure. Well, most of the students don't even know what happened in the Soviet Union. Well, why is that exactly? And the reason for that is that radical leftist ideologue intellectuals in the West have never properly apologized for the role they played in the absolute murderousness of the 20th century. And so students don't even know about it. So they can come out to McMaster behind their damnable poster with a hammer and sickle on it and act like they're virtuous.
Do you think
it's
that
appalling.
Do you think that trend was only sort of significant to that specific McMaster incident, or do you see this type of ideology influencing campus protests beyond McMaster in general?
Well, I think that part of it's everywhere. It's not just in campus protests. I mean, the campuses are overrun in large part with disciplines that have, in my estimation, no valid reason to exist. I think disciplines like women's studies should be defunded. Any of the activist disciplines whose primary role is the overthrow of, for example, of the patriarchy, which is about as ill-defined a concept as you could possibly formulate, that it's enough, that we've done enough public funding of that sort of thing. We're providing full-time, destructive employment for people who are doing nothing but causing trouble, and
So
seriously nothing.
You would say that because you think that these departments are causing harm or could have the potential to cause harm, that university administrations should defund them, right?
No, I don't think they should defund them. Who the hell cares what I think about them? That isn't why I think that they should be defunded at all.
Okay.
I think they should be defunded because what they promote has zero intellectual credibility. Their research methods don't qualify as research methods. Their publications, 80% of humanities publications now garner 0 citations. That's not very many citations. And it's